In most stories about World War II, trains are background noise. They whistle in the distance. They bring troops to the front. They carry prisoners away. They flash past the camera as symbols of war machine. But for one railway officer, trains were not just transport. They were his battlefield. He did not have tanks. He did not have a frontline command. He had timetables, locomotives, freight cars, damaged tracks, and a pencil that decided who moved and who waited. On that pencil, entire battles quietly depended. The war on this front was supposed to be fast. It always is. On the map spread in warm headquarters, arrows moved quickly. From the border to the river. From the river to the city. From the city to final victory. But the reality that greeted the army was slower and heavier. Mud, snow, burned bridges, bombed roads, villages that did not want to be liberated for the third time. Tanks needed fuel. Infantry needed ammunition. Artillery needed shells. Everyone needed food. And behind all of that stood one simple, ugly fact. Without trains, the front would starve. The railway officer knew this long before any general did. He had spent years studying lines on a map that other people barely glanced at. Single tracks through forests, double lines near big cities, small junctions in the middle of nowhere that looked unimportant until you realized how many routes they fed. Before the war, his work had been dull. Coal, grain, passengers, schedules. Once in a while, a crisis, a snowstorm, a derailment, a politician's special train. He was not a hero. He was a man whose job was to make sure other people arrived on time. When the war came, he thought his job would be simple. The same thing, just with uniforms. He was wrong. The enemy understood railways too. They bombed bridges. They hit junctions. They sent saboteurs to loosen bolts, blow up culverts, and derail freight in the dark. What was once a network became a set of damaged nerves. Signals flickered, tracks twisted, stations filled with stranded cars. The army at the front sent a simple message back. We need more. Send it now. The railway officer looked at his shredded timetable and understood that now no longer meant anything. Unless he changed the way the entire system thought about trains. He began with a simple question that did not sound heroic at all. What if trains are not just delivery trucks but pieces on a chessboard? He knew three things. The enemy was watching the rails. The army was addicted to them. He did not have enough capacity to satisfy every demand honestly. So the choices were: try and fail, sending a little bit everywhere too late, or choose where to be strong, where to be weak, and where to pretend to be strong or weak. That last part, pretending, was where trains stopped being just trains and started becoming a weapon. He took a fresh map. Not the colorful one with front lines and arrows that generals loved, but the plain one showing rails, sidings, depots, gradients, tunnels. To him, this was the real shape of the war. Front lines moved. Rail lines did not, unless someone destroyed them. He circled three things: a junction town that fed supplies to a whole army group, a secondary line that looked minor, but could bypass a destroyed bridge if repaired, a small yard far from the front, where trains could be assembled and sent out at night. Then he circled something else. Not a place, a pattern. Enemy bombers hit the same kinds of targets again and again. Bridges near rivers, visible marshalling yards, big stations with glass roofs. They were predictable. So he decided to become predictable too, on the surface, and completely different underneath. The first step was to change the meaning of full and empty. Before the war, a train loaded with coal or grain was obviously important. Now, a train loaded with shells and fuel was more important still. The enemy knew that. So they watched for fully loaded trains, long strings of freight cars, heavy locomotives laboring up gradients, columns moving at regular, slow speeds that made them easy targets. The railway officer began to ask, what if the most dangerous-looking trains are worthless, and the most valuable ones look like nothing at all? He issued new instructions. Some trains would run heavier, Then they looked a few outwardly plain cars packed with critical cargo, hidden among ordinary wagons. Other trains would run lighter, then they looked long, noisy. Impressive columns with a lot of empty or low-value cars, designed to attract attention, not avoid it. He altered schedules. Decoy trains would run at predictable times on heavily watched routes. Real supply trains would move at odd hours, broken into smaller segments, through secondary lines that seemed unimportant to the enemy air crews and reconnaissance analysts. The network began to hum with tempting, obvious targets. Long, fat trains moving exactly where bombers could find them. To the units at the front, what mattered was not how impressive a train looked from the sky, but whether their shells and fuel actually arrived. The second step was to rethink priority. Every unit thought it was the most important. Every request came marked urgent. The railway officer knew this was impossible, so he stopped asking, "Who shouts loudest?" Instead, he asked, "If this train does not arrive, what breaks?" Sometimes the answer was obvious. If the front received no fuel, tanks stopped. If artillery received no shells, barrages failed. If food failed to arrive for too long, discipline and strength eroded. But sometimes, the critical train was not the one any general was thinking about. Sometimes it was a train full of replacement rails, telegraph equipment, workers to repair a blown line. If that train did not run, no other train could follow. So he began ranking trains not by who they served, but by how many other trains depended on them. In his notebook, certain trains received small marks, not visible to anyone outside his office. Those were the ones he would protect at any cost, rerouting them, giving them the best locomotives, clearing tracks for them in the middle of the night while less vital cargo sat waiting. He was not chasing glory. He was chasing continuity. Because a front line does not collapse in an instant for lack of one bullet. It collapses when 1,000 tiny delays stack on top of each other until nothing moves. The third step was the most dangerous. He realized that if trains could move supplies, they could also move something else. Surprise. An army that can shift troops quickly is an army that can make the enemy guess, but only if that movement is hidden. The railway officer knew that the enemy was watching the big hubs and obvious routes, so he began to experiment, moving small units at strange hours, concentrating them near quiet sectors, using dimmed lights, blacked-out windows, and false cargo manifests. Here, trains stopped being support and became part of operational deception. He didn't command the troops inside them. He didn't pick their targets, but by deciding where they could appear suddenly, he was giving his side something as valuable as tanks, the ability to surprise. One evening, as he sat at his cluttered desk, the first real test of this new way of thinking arrived without warning. A courier brought a message from the Army Group Command. Enemy reconnaissance had spotted heavy concentrations of their forces preparing for an offensive against a specific sector of the front. The sector in question was held by a thin, tired line of infantry and a few local reserves. If the enemy attacked there with full force, they might break through before armored reserves could be brought from elsewhere. The order was urgent. Reinforce that sector. We need fresh troops and ammunition there as fast as possible. But on the railway map, the problem was worse than the message said. The quickest route to that threatened sector ran through a junction that had been bombed 2 nights earlier. Bridges were damaged. Tracks were twisted and burnt. Repair crews were working, but the line was not usable yet. Alternative routes existed, but they were longer, single-tracked, and already heavily loaded with regular supply trains. If he simply added more trains to those lines, he would create a traffic jam so massive that nothing would arrive on time. He could send too much and get nothing, or send less and risk sending too little. The railway officer stared at the map for a long moment. Then he did something uncomfortable and necessary. He took a red pencil and drew a line through several existing train paths. Cancelled, delayed, rerouted. Some unit at the front would curse him tomorrow for not getting their supplies on schedule. They would not know that by sacrificing their convenience, he was trying to buy something larger, time, Time for reinforcements to arrive at the threatened sector before the enemy's tanks did. Time for a line that looked weak on the map to suddenly become stronger than expected. And trains, which were supposed to be just background logistics, were about to become a secret weapon. The next morning, train crews across the region woke up into a different railway than the one they thought they served. They didn't know it yet. To them, it was another day of checking locomotives, warming boilers, coupling cars, waiting for clearance. They had their usual paperwork, their usual routes, their usual grudges, but somewhere far above them, on the organizational chart, one man with a pencil had quietly rewritten their day. The railway officer's plan started with a brutal decision. The network would not try to do everything. It would do one thing well enough to matter. That one thing was getting reinforcements and ammunition to the threatened sector, before the enemy offensive turned a thin line into a broken one. Everything else, nice to have deliveries, routine movements, even some badly needed supplies, could wait. So he began to carve space. He issued orders to stations and dispatchers. Low priority trains were to be held in sidings. Some scheduled passenger services would be suspended on key routes. Freight that could stay where it was for another day or two would not move. The instruction that spread down the telegraph lines was simple and hated. Stop more trains, so that the right ones can move. Railwaymen cursed him without saying his name. Station masters stared at crowded sidings, knowing they would be blamed for every delay. But slowly, on the main routes that still worked, tracks began to clear. Not everywhere. Not for long. Just enough for a few critical trains to have clean paths. He then turned to the secondary lines. On the map, these thin black threads looked insignificant. Lower speed, sharp curves, old bridges, stations barely larger than villages. To generals, they were irrelevant. To the railway officer, they were arteries that had never been asked to carry a full heartbeat. Now they would. He called the dispatcher responsible for a minor branch line. "You're going to handle traffic you've never handled before," he said. "In sending you troop trains and ammunition, you will treat them as if your own town depends on them. Because it does." The dispatcher hesitated. "But our line can't support that many heavy trains in one night. The sidings are short. The signals." The officer cut him off gently. "You won't be doing it alone. I will schedule every movement. You just make sure that when a train enters your line, it does not stop for more than 10 minutes unless I tell you." He hung up and began blocking out the path. This train would leave the inland assembly yard at dusk, run under partial blackout, take the long way through secondary lines, arrive at a small junction well behind the threatened sector, and then unload its troops and supplies to be trucked the last stretch forward. It would not look impressive on a reconnaissance photo. No endless columns of cars. No big, shiny engines. Just another modest-length freight in the dark. But the men inside it would be what stood between thin line and no line. At the same time, he activated the other part of his plan. Decoys. If the enemy was going to watch the rails, let them watch something. He arranged for several fat trains to run on the more obvious routes that would normally be used to reinforce the threatened sector if the junction and bridges were not blown. These trains were loaded with low-value cargo, empty cars, damaged equipment being sent back for repair, even, in some cases, nothing at all in the middle cars. What mattered was not the cargo. What mattered was the shape, long, heavy, easy to see, going in a direction that would make enemy analysts say, "They're moving something important here." Hit that line. Pilots and bombardiers always preferred big, obvious targets. The railway officer was giving them some sacrifices made of steel and time, not blood. On the receiving end, the threatened sector's commanders saw only half the picture. They sent more urgent messages. When will the reinforcements arrive? Do we have enough ammunition for a sustained defense? What about fuel for our few remaining vehicles? The replies they received were careful and unsatisfying. Reinforcements en route, expected by early morning. Ammunition trains scheduled. Unload points will be notified by liaison officers. They did not see the routing diagrams, the cancelled trains, the argument the railway officer had with a senior staff officer, who wanted his own sector's supply to take precedence. "If I feed your line today," he had said quietly, "there may be no line left to feed tomorrow." He was not popular. He was necessary. Meanwhile, on the enemy side, an entirely different map was being studied. Reconnaissance photos were laid out on a table. Black and white images of tracks, fields, and small towns. Analysts pointed at them. "Here, see, increased train traffic on this route in the last few days." They circled a major line leading roughly toward the threatened sector. On it, long, clear images of big trains moving in daylight or at dusk. "High-value targets," someone said. "Probably reinforcements or fuel columns. We should hit them before they can unload." Squadrons were tasked. Bombers were briefed. That night, engines roared into the sky to go hunting for trains that looked exactly like what they were expecting, and found them. They dropped bombs. They saw explosions blossom along the rails. They returned with gun camera footage of burning cars and ruptured tracks. On the reports, it would look like a success. Enemy railway movement to Sector X severely disrupted. Multiple trains destroyed. But those trains had not been the knife. They had been the decoy. The real blade was sliding quietly in darkness along an old, crooked, barely maintained line that nobody thought was worth bombing. Inside one of those real trains, conditions were miserable. Troops sat packed into cold, dimly lit cars. Windows were blacked out or covered with tarps. The air smelled of sweat, damp wool, and old wood. The train did not move smoothly. It would lurch forward, then slow to a crawl, then stop for a few minutes on a siding, while another train rattled past in the opposite direction. Sometimes, there was a long delay in the dark. The men muttered. They wondered if someone had forgotten them. They tried to sleep sitting up. They did not know that each stop and start was part of a carefully controlled sequence, that they were being threaded through gaps in an overloaded system, given just enough motion to reach their destination on time, without revealing that something important was passing through. To them, it was just uncomfortable. To the railway officer, it was the difference between on the front by dawn and stuck 50 kilometers short. When the attack begins, back in his office, the railway officer watched the clock more than the map now. He had a rough schedule in his head. If a train left the inland yard at this time, it should reach the branch junction by this time. Then the last major station by that time. He had arranged for liaison officers to wire short confirmations from key stops. Train 47 arrived, departed to 15. Train 52 arrived, loaded with infantry, departed 3 or 5. Each new tick on the log was a small victory over chaos. Each delay was a possible disaster in the making. A line cut by bombing could throw everything off. A locomotive failure could turn one train into a plug that blocked a whole section. He had built redundancy where he could. Spare engines in certain depots, alternate sidings, prearranged signals that would allow trains to reverse and detour. But there were still too many things he could not control. Weather, enemy bombers, human error. He sat with his pen ready, waiting for messages that either matched his mental timetable or shattered it. Just before dawn, as the sky turned from black to deep blue, a critical signal came through. A short, clipped wire from a station not far behind the threatened sector. First reinforcement train arrived. Unloading now. Second train expected in 1 hour. He didn't smile. He simply marked the time and then, for the first time in hours, leaned back in his chair. The line on his map that represented the front had not moved, but the reality behind it had. Where there had been only tired infantry and thin reserves, there were now fresh battalions stepping off boxcars, crates of ammunition, fuel drums being rolled down hastily built ramps. Trucks and horse-drawn wagons began to swarm around the station, loading and departing toward the front. The railway officer had brought a fist to a place that had been an open hand. He had done it by sacrificing comfort elsewhere, by deceiving enemy eyes, and by treating rails and schedules as if they were artillery firing tables. Somewhere, on another sector of the front, a unit would open their supply crates today and find them empty. They would not receive what they had been promised. They would curse the railway. They would say someone messed up. They would not know that their delay had bought time for another unit that would otherwise not exist tomorrow. The railway officer knew. He carried that knowledge like a stone in his pocket. It was not a medal. It was a weight. The real test, however, was still ahead. Bringing reinforcements to the sector was only half the story. The enemy attack had not yet begun. It was coming. When it hit, the front would either bend and hold, or shatter. If it held, some of the credit would belong to those trains that the enemy never saw. If it broke anyway, all his clever scheduling would look like nothing more than a delay of the inevitable. The attack began in the way so many attacks in this war began. First with sound, artillery, distant at first, then closer, shells walking forward from the enemy rear toward the thin line of trenches and foxholes that marked the front. For the soldiers in that threatened sector, morning arrived as a grey sky lit by orange flashes. The ground shook, dirt rained down into dugouts, telephone lines snapped, radios hissed. They had known this was coming. They just hadn't known when. Now they knew. A company commander, hunched in a small command post near the front, checked his map with numb fingers. He knew his own weakness too well. His men were tired, his positions only partly prepared, his anti-tank weapons few. He had spent the last 48 hours counting how many rounds he had left and imagining how many tanks the enemy could afford to send. But this morning, there was something new on his side of the ledger. When the shelling eased for a moment, he heard the sound he hadn't expected to hear in time. Engines. Not enemy engines. His own. Trucks grinding up muddy roads. Voices shouting over banging tailgates. Metal clanking as crates were shifted. Reinforcements. They had arrived at night, disgorged from dark trains at a station behind the line, and now they were filtering forward. Fresh infantry companies, extra machine guns, ammunition for mortars and rifles, a handful of anti-tank guns hauled into position at the last moment. The company commander didn't know how close it had been. He didn't know about cancelled trains elsewhere, or decoy runs under bombing. He only knew that someone, somewhere had gotten them here just in time. So when the first enemy tanks finally appeared out of the smoke, he was not waiting with nothing. He was waiting with enough. Not abundance. Not luxury. Enough. From the enemy side, the attack looked, at first, like a standard offensive. Artillery pounded suspected positions. Infantry formed up behind their own tanks and assault guns. Officers checked watches, blew whistles, and gave the signal to move. The plan was simple on paper. Smash the front with fire. Punch through with armor. Roll up the flanks before reserves could arrive. Their reconnaissance reports from days earlier had described this sector as lightly held. Their railway analysts had seen big trains being hit on the main routes nearby. They believed they would be striking before the defenders could truly reinforce. They were wrong. Not because their information was completely false, but because it was incomplete. It had not seen the quiet lines, the crooked routes, the unimportant stations. It had not seen the pencil hovering over the timetable in a cramped office far to the rear. As the enemy armor rolled forward across churned earth, they met more resistance than they had expected. Machine guns opened up from positions that hadn't been there last week. Mortars fell with a density that suggested fresh stockpiles. Infantry squads that might have broken and run a few days earlier now had enough grenades, enough ammunition, and enough neighbors in the next foxhole over to decide to stay. The tanks still pushed, but their commanders began to sense that this was not just a tired line they could brush aside. Calls went up the chain. Defenders stronger than anticipated, encountering reinforced positions, anti-tank guns in unexpected numbers. On their maps, nothing had changed. On the ground, everything had. At the peak of the battle, one of the newly arrived anti-tank guns fired its first shot. The crew had been unloaded from a train only hours earlier. They had rolled their gun off a flat car, hitched it to a truck, bumped down bad roads in darkness, set up in a shallow scrape of earth while someone pointed and said, "Here, cover that draw. They'll come through there if they're not idiots." Now, as a tank nosed into view at the far end of the shallow depression, they saw the IF disappear. They fired. The shot hit the front of the tank. Armor cracked. Smoke burst from hatches. The vehicle lurched to a stop. The crew whooped, then quickly reloaded. Their second shot missed. The third hit another tank trying to swing around the wreck of the first. By the afternoon, that one gun crew would count their kills on dirty fingers. Without ever thinking about the railway car numbers that had brought them here, they would say, "Good thing we got here last night," and leave it at that. In a dugout converted to a small command post, a battalion commander spoke with his regimental superior over a crackling line. "Yes, they hit us hard. Yes, they've broken into some forward positions, but the line is still intact. The reinforcements you sent, they made the difference." He did not know that those reinforcements had nearly been stuck to stations back, because a bridge repair train had almost derailed, or that a dispatcher on a minor line had decided to bend a safety rule, just enough to let one more heavy train pass before closing the section. He only knew that they were here. In his report that evening, he would write phrases like, "Arrivals from the rear enabled us to seal gaps. Fresh units allowed for local counterattacks that stabilized the situation." History, if it ever cared, would see those as routine lines, not as the echo of a night of controlled chaos on the rails. Meanwhile, miles away from the noise and smoke, the railway officer received his own kind of report, not from the front, but from the stations. Reinforcement trains 1 and to have completed unloading. Ammunition train 3 delayed for 20 minutes at waypoint, but arrived within acceptable window. Minimal losses due to enemy air attack. Decoy trains absorbed most strikes. He read them, line by line, and felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Relief that the system he had pushed to its limit had not collapsed. Guilt because he knew where the cost had been paid. In the unit that did not get its spare parts today. In the factories whose coal delivery had been postponed. In the civilians whose passenger train had been quietly cancelled. He had traded many small problems for the chance to prevent one very large one. From the point of view of the war, it was the right choice. From the bottom of his own conscience, it was not clean. That night, as the enemy offensive in that sector slowed to a grinding, bloody crawl instead of a breakthrough, the phrase most often used at the front was simple: good timing. The reinforcements came with good timing. The ammo showed up just in time. Transport worked for once. But good timing was not an accident. It had been built out of cancelled trains, decoy trains, rerouted trains, and the refusal to treat railways as a neutral background instead of a tool. The railway officer leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment, and then reached for a fresh sheet of paper. Tomorrow, new requests would come. New crises would appear on the map, and once again, he would have to decide who moves, who waits, and where the still river of trains would quietly shape the war. By the end of that week, the front line on the map looked almost unchanged. A shallow bulge here, a small dent there. Arrows that had promised a deep breakthrough had stopped short. To someone looking only at the big picture, it would seem as if nothing dramatic had happened at all. No major city had fallen. No famous fortress had been overrun. No spectacular encirclement had taken place. Just another line holding under pressure. But if you zoomed into the level of one sector, one morning, one battle, you would find stories that had hinged on the quiet work of rails and timetables. For the soldiers at the front, the memory of that week would be simple and physical. Too little sleep, too much noise, new faces in neighboring foxholes, crates of ammunition arriving when they were needed most. If years later, someone asked one of them, "How did you hold when you were supposed to be so weak there?" he might shrug and say, "Reinforcements came just in time. Supply was better than usual that week. We were lucky." He would not be lying. From his perspective, luck is what it felt like. He did not see the arguments over which trains to cancel. He did not see what almost didn't happen. He only saw that when the enemy came, he had enough men and bullets to meet them. For the enemy commander who had launched the offensive, the debriefing would be harsher. On his map, everything had seemed promising. The sector was rated as thinly held. His forces in the area were strong. His artillery was in place. His logistics officers had assured him that there was enough fuel and ammunition for a sustained effort. He had even been told that recent bombing had seriously disrupted the enemy's railway movements. Yet when his attack went in, he found stiffer resistance than expected, fresh units where there should have been only exhausted ones, and defensive fires more intense than his staff had told him to anticipate. In his report, he might write, "Enemy appears to have reinforced the sector shortly before the attack. Despite our efforts to interdict railway traffic." Higher up, someone would underline that sentence, frown, and demand better bombing plans, better reconnaissance. No one in that chain of criticism would ever read the railway officer's own logbook. His name would probably not appear in any enemy file, and yet, invisible to both sides' glory hunters, he had been one of the people who turned a sharp attack into a dull one. For the railway officer himself, the war continued as a line of days and nights blurred together. He saw things almost no one else did. The way a single destroyed bridge could paralyze 3 divisions 200 kilometers away. The way a shortage of repair crews could become more dangerous than a shortage of bullets. The way saying no to one demand could be the only way to say yes to something more critical. He watched his network like a doctor watches a patient with failing organs. He knew that if the rails were cut into many places, if the locomotives broke down faster than they could be maintained, if the men running the switches and signals and yards became too tired or too careless, then no amount of courage at the front would be able to compensate. He also knew that when things went right, someone else would get the credit. Some general would say, "My reserve divisions arrived in time." Some report would praise the fighting spirit of the defenders. He did not begrudge them that. He only wished, on the worst days, that the trains would stop breaking down. There is a quiet irony in his story. In a war remembered for tanks, planes, and giant battles, one of the most decisive systems rarely appears in the foreground. Railways do not look heroic. They are steel lines stretching over anonymous landscapes, stations that all look similar, timetables that all look boring. But in a modern war, rails are not background. They are the skeleton. If the skeleton breaks, the body cannot move. An army may have the best tanks, the bravest infantry, the most accurate guns, and still fail if the fuel, shells, and replacements do not arrive. The railway officer in this story understood that. He stopped thinking of trains as neutral logistics and started thinking of them as options. Options he could open or close for his own side, and options he could try to deny to the enemy through deception and timing. In doing so, he turned a system everyone took for granted into a weapon almost no one saw. What does this story really show? It shows that wars are not decided only in the places where bullets are fired. Some of the most important decisions are made by people who never see the enemy directly. Just in time often means just barely made it because someone suffered somewhere else. It also shows how easy it is to misunderstand success. From the outside, a held line can look like stubborn bravery. From the inside, it is often a cooperation of timing, planning, sacrifice, and yes, bravery linked together by things as unglamorous as bolts, coal, and departure times. In most histories, this railway officer would be at best a footnote. In the rear, railway services efficiently supported the movement of reinforcements. One line, no details, no mention of the night he cancelled the wrong trains to save the right ones. No mention of the decoy freights deliberately sent under enemy bombers. No mention of the arguments with officers who outranked him, but understood trains less than he did. That is how it often is for people who work in the background. If they fail, everyone notices. If they succeed, it looks as if nothing special happened at all. In the end, this is not really a story about trains. It is a story about responsibility, about a man who realized that his battlefield was not a trench or a cockpit, but a map of lines and numbers, and who accepted that his decisions would decide whether other people lived or died. Even if they never knew his name, he turned trains into a secret weapon, not by magic, but by refusing to treat his job as just logistics. And somewhere, on a quiet evening after the war, a veteran from that once threatened sector might sit at a table, stare at his hands, and say, "We shouldn't have held that weak, but for some reason, everything we needed showed up when it mattered." He would call it luck. You, having seen this story, know that behind that luck was a tired officer with a pencil and a railway map, who fought his war with departure times instead of rifles, and won just enough for others to do the rest.